Greetings, I'm Shad, and out of all the debates that rage on the internet that are about swords, because there's just a lot of debates that rage on the internet, and I won't go into those, but about swords specifically, one of the most popular is Katana versus Longsword. You see this again and again. You see videos trying to prove and settle the debate once and for all, and then you see videos debunking those videos trying to settle the debate once and for all. It's a very, very popular discussion, and some of these videos, I reckon, do a decent analysis, a fair balancing up, and of course some do it very poorly, where the situation or the tests are very rigged and it just doesn't reflect the truth of the matter. And so here is my take on the subject. Another video to go amongst the thousands of videos on this debate, but I would like to think I can bring to the table some thoughts and perspectives that haven't been acknowledged, addressed, or discussed as of yet that might help us get a better understanding of this debate. One of the first things people will raise in this discussion, katana versus longsword, is how the swords are made, and they'll point towards the katana using an ingenious method of metal folding and differential hardening that makes it far superior to any other type of sword. Okay, I've actually dedicated, 4 whole videos to that subject. Well, you can discount the first one, so 3. It's my katana series, there's 5 videos all up, but video 2, 3, and 4 address that whole topic. The funny thing about it actually means very little. As soon as a sword is made to a high enough level of quality that it will function adequately for its use, there is not much difference in how swords are made in that regard. If they're good enough, you won't find too much difference until the sword gets put under a huge amount of stress. That is where how the sword is made becomes a far more significant topic. But if you use the sword right, okay, they will rarely be put under such huge amounts of stress. And for those of you who are thinking, well, what about those huge amounts of stress? Because of course they do happen. Swords did break in history, and you might be thinking that because a katana is made in a superior way, it is therefore superior to any other type of sword, including longsword. Well, that is actually a massive assumption. A katana is not made in a superior way to other swords. It's made in an ingenious way for the materials that existed in the time, but that does not render a sword or create a sword that is inherently superior in terms of its quality of steel and its internal structure than other means of manufacture, including those means that did exist in Europe. For more information, please do go and watch the 3 parts in my katana series, part 2, 3, and 4, to get a full breakdown of what's happening in regards to manufacturing of katanas. Spring steel. Spring steel is awesome, okay? But no, the real thing that we need to compare when comparing katanas and longswords is not actually how they're made, is how they are designed. One of the things that nearly all these comparisons don't acknowledge is one of the most significant things to consider, which is why so many of these comparisons just are not reality, okay? And that is this simple question. What type of katana and what type of longsword? Now, the latter part is, I feel, a bit more significant. What type of longsword? Because the katana has a far more standardized design. When I say that, though, you need to understand that there is still decent variation within that design. Those variations are significant, but what we need to realize is that all those variations don't change the katana from what it is primarily supposed to do, which is to cut effectively. And that makes its design far more standardized than many other types of swords. Not all of them. I mean, for instance, the rapier is a very standardized design. If you understand the right context and definition of what a rapier is, I need to kind of just add that part there. But when we come to the longsword and arming sword, the 1- and 2-handed most common medieval sword, those swords allow for far more variations than does the katana. I have had people try and call me out on that fact and say, no, the katana actually has just as many variations as the longsword, and I'll stick with the longsword, don't worry about the arming sword, because everything I say with the longsword applies to the arming sword as well. And I'll say, it's just as much. I disagree with that, and I will share with you why. And when I say that, I'm not saying that there is no variation on the katana. I'm saying those variations that do exist on the katana don't change the katana from what it is most primarily meant to be used for, which is cutting, right? And in contrast to the longsword, it can have design features that totally emphasize it to cut, or totally emphasize it to thrust, or have a nice balance in between. When looking at the katana, I can find 5 points of significant variation. Length of the handle, length of the blade, the depth of the blade, its distal taper, and its rate of curve. 5 points of significant variation. Now, you might be thinking, well, there's other parts that the katana in its design can have variations in, like the size of the tsuba, the width of the blade, the profile taper, and the length of the tang. Tell me if I've missed anything. I don't think I have. Now, the reason why I don't include those last 4 parts, because the standard variations on those elements I've just mentioned won't have a significant impact in how that sword functions. Tsubas stay within a very standard kind of size. There's not significant variation in tsubas at all, apart from aesthetic design. The width of the blade varies in very small increments, okay? Not significantly large increments, and in my mind, that wouldn't have a significant impact on its function. Now, the profile taper, I'm not talking about distal taper, I'm talking about profile taper. That's one of the things that stay most standard within the katana. Now, katanas can have some profile taper, alright? And sometimes not at all, but they don't have full profile tapering, nothing compared to what we see on European swords. And the length of the tang, this is an interesting one. The length of the tang does vary, sometimes halfway down the handle, sometimes it looks like it goes all the way. But when I've looked at it, historical katanas just by themselves, I find that the length of the tang seems to correlate very directly to the length of the blade. What that means is that I haven't found, in any case, that for the same length of blade, they do not make a larger tang to alter its point of balance. And those are all the possible elements on a katana that can have variation, and out of all of them, 5 of them can have enough variation in my mind to have significant effect in function. Well, there you go, and you might be saying, well, there you go, I've proven that there can be different types of katanas. But you need to remember that all of these variations do not alter the katana enough to the point that you would need to fight with it in a different way. So when people say katana first longsword, they are generally referring to the standard katana design. And even with the variations that I've pointed out, we can infer that all those katanas and all those variations will still perform decently the same. But when we come to the longsword, we have a completely different situation. The longsword can be varied in its design to a far greater degree than the katana can. In fact, the longsword has up to 10 significant variations that it can have in its design to make it different, as opposed to the katana's 5. As I see it anyway, and they are these: length of the handle, type of crossguard, type of pummel, length of the blade, the width of the blade, the depth of the blade, the profile taper, the distal taper, the multiple cross-sectional geometries that longswords can have, and also the tip acuity. 10. And in regards to the longsword, some of its points of variation that it shares with the katana, for instance length, it allows for far more variation than what the katana does before you would consider the katana a different sword. Looking at length specifically, the katana's length, in comparison, is actually about as long as a standard arming sword, a one-handed sword, but if we were to push it, okay, we'll say bastard sword, because bastard sword is a type of longsword. Now you can find katanas with blades that are a bit longer to about the length of a standard longsword, but the issue is, the longsword blade can even go further to the point that you would almost consider it a great sword, but there's a new kind of classification that is being shared around the sword enthusiast community, and that is war sword. And war sword being the longest and biggest variation of longsword that you can get. Now, a katana with a blade as long as a war sword wouldn't be considered a katana anymore. It would be considered a tashi. Tashi? I can't pronounce it right. But you can still consider war swords longswords, and in my definition I do. I consider war sword to be the longest variation of longsword. So by analysing the possible variations that each type of sword can have, we actually come to a very clear and very definitive conclusion. Because the longsword has so much more variation in what it can be, by that very nature it can always have a specific kind of design that can match or even excel a quality in which a katana has. Whether this is in cutting, point of balance, ease of use, how easy it is to redirect the blade, or thrusting, just through the simple math of crunching the numbers by combining every possible longsword design you could make based on its variations, and every type of katana that you could make based on its main variations. There's always going to be more types of longsword variations than there are katana, therefore you can always find a longsword that is capable of at least matching, if not exceeding, a quality that the katana possesses.
choices. So hands down, the longsword can win, whether you're trying to compare speed, cutting capacity, reach, weight, leverage, point of balance, thrusting, hand protection. The longsword has more potential to win because it has more options in its design. What we have to acknowledge here, and again this is a thing that is so often missed in all these comparisons, is that it's actually an unfair comparison and why so much confusion is being created through this. If you were to compare a katana in its cutting capacity against a longsword that wasn't built to be a beastie cutter, well then clearly the longsword is going to fall short in that regard, wouldn't it? If it's not good at cutting, if there's less mass in the blade, this sword was probably meant to be quicker in the hand. Also to have better reach, meaning it was meant for dueling primarily. And then testing that sword in circumstances in which it is not meant to excel at, of course it's not going to perform well. The problem that then happens is that after people do these tests, they assume that the longsword they are testing is representative of all longsword designs in the way that they assume that the katana they're testing is representative of all other katanas. The issue is that both swords have variation, but the longsword has more variation than the katana, so the tests done with the katana are more likely to be representative of other types of katanas than the tests are for the longsword to be representative of the other types of longswords. And so you simply can't take the tests of one type of longsword and say this is how all types of longswords would then behave. That's impossible. The category of longsword is simply too diverse. The issues that exist in trying to compare katanas and longswords are about the same type of issues that exist if you were to try and compare PlayStations to PC. In regards to the PlayStation, there are only 4 models of PlayStations that have ever been built, each with a different amount of variation between the other, but all meant to fulfill the exact same purpose. Whereas the PC has so many more options for its variation and configuration. You can always build a PC to at least match or exceed one or more qualities that the PlayStations have. Now, this isn't a perfect analogy, so please don't take it too literal or too far, but it's a good comparison. Now, having said all this, there are some qualities, sword qualities, that one type of sword has that the other doesn't. For instance, the katana is single-edged, the longsword double-edged. Now, I have done a whole video comparing the qualities of single-edged and double-edged swords. Nothing else, just single versus double. And in that video, I found that single-edged swords had the potential to be more superior than double-edged swords. Please go watch the video if you would like to see my comparison. The thing is, even though I found that single-edged swords had the potential to be twice as rigid, or twice as light, or have twice as acute an edge angle, when the design of a double-edged sword is focused to excel at one of those qualities, the differences between the single and double-edged swords are very small. Even though I found single-edged swords to have the advantage, it won't be that much of an advantage. Still, in the end, I would pick a single-edged sword over a double-edged sword if there were no other disadvantages. In a direct comparison of katanas and longswords, I do find some disadvantages, specifically qualities that the longsword design has that are mutually exclusive. What am I talking about? The crossguard and length of blade. The crossguard can get side rings which offer all the advantages that the katana's tsuba can offer, and then it has the extended quillins. This type of guard is in every objective way superior to the katana's tsuba. And to go even further, the longsword eventually developed a full swept hilt, orders of magnitude better than a small disc guard. And then to the next point, the longsword's blade is always longer than the katana's, specifically because when the katana's blade gets past a certain length, it stops being a katana. Longsword versus tachi or longsword versus nodachi might be a bit of a different comparison. But that's not the comparison that everyone makes, it's longsword versus katana. This advantage in reach that the longsword possesses is incredibly significant. Anyone who has ever used a sword of differing lengths against an opponent who has also differing lengths will know the profound advantage that reach gives. The only other quality that is mutually exclusive to the katana in such a way that would make it more beneficial is the curve. And there is an assumption that the curve increases cutting capacity to a very significant level. I do not believe this. In fact, after testing it with my own practical experience, having used the different types of swords, and having measured the difference in cutting ratio between the katana's curve and a straight blade, I have found that the advantage is so minute that it's not even worth acknowledging or bothering to consider. Please go watch part 5 in my katana series and my video, Why the Katana Has a Curve, to hear my detailed thoughts on this subject. But ultimately, this means that the longsword has mutually exclusive qualities that add advantages to its design more so than the katana does. So with these specific and mutually exclusive qualities considered, combined with the fact that the longsword can have so many different variations to match or exceed the katana's cutting capacity, even those advantages it receives for being single-edged, because a longsword allows for a much larger blade profile than the katana, it can receive additional cutting capacity due to mass that will overcome its disadvantage or the advantages that the katana can inherently receive for being single-edged. So again, with these exclusive qualities of having a longer blade, better crossguard, and being able to match every other quality that the katana can excel at because of its more open design allowances, the longsword is clearly a superior sword, but this shouldn't be held up as a great win because it's a very unfair comparison. You're essentially comparing multiple types of swords to a much more singular type of sword.
Does this mean that all longswords are better than the katana at cutting? Of course it doesn't. But also, in respect to that, does it mean all katanas are better than all longswords at cutting? No! What we can say in a general sense is that the standard katana is more focused and emphasized towards cutting than the standard longsword because it's far harder to try and define what the standard longsword is. So a far better comparison isn't necessarily are katanas better than longswords, but is this specific katana better at this specific task than this specific longsword? I hope I've given you some food for thought. Thank you for watching, and until next time, farewell.